The man known to history as King Cetshwayo of Zululand was born most probably in the year 1832 at the Mlambongwenya homestead in the southeast of Zululand, a kingdom in the northeast of what is now South Africa. His father was Mpande, a son of Senzengakona, a man who had been king of the Zulus through the 1790s and into the 19th century, maintaining his position down to 1816 when he died, though like nearly all Zulu rulers, Senzengakona's reign had been characterized by periods when his power was challenged, often by his own family members. At the time of Cetshwayo's birth, Mpande was something of an outcast within Zululand, as his half-brother Dingane had seized control of the kingdom in 1828 through violent means, a decision which Mpande had never fully accepted. Cetshwayo's mother was Nkumbazi, a member of the Zungu chiefly house amongst the Zulus. Although the Zulus practiced polygamy and their kings and chiefs typically had multiple wives, Nkumbazi was Mpande's great wife, a senior position which was often risen to on the basis of the family status of the wife or through the payment of a large ilobolo, the Zulu word for a bride price, the equivalent of a dowry in medieval and early modern Europe. This ensured that Cetshwayo had a more esteemed position amongst Mpande's sons as the child of his marriage to his great wife. Some accounts place Cetshwayo's year of birth as early as 1826 or 1827, but these are most probably inaccurate. His name was a peculiar one for a future king, basically meaning the slandered one in Zulu. The Zulu kingdom that Cetshwayo had been born into was a relatively young power in southern Africa. The Zulus were an Nguni people of the broader Bantu ethno-linguistic group which dominated most of the African continent south of Lake Victoria in east-central Africa. The Zulus took their name from an 18th century leader by the name of Zulu, but it was really a young warlord by the name of Shaka, under whom they emerged as a major power in the late 1810s and 1820s. Shaka revolutionized their army, introducing an Nguni form of conscription and military tactics, including the use of regiments and new weapons. With these, he and his armies were able to establish Zulu control over a large stretch of territory in what is now the northeastern corner of South Africa, between the Tugela and Pongola rivers. Yet, as powerful as the Zulus became under Shaka, they were an anarchic people in many ways. Society was divided into kraals or homesteads, where powerful regional rulers based their positions on control of large heads of cattle and other resources. There was constant toing and froing in terms of who owed allegiance to whom. The clearest example was Shaka, who despite his pivotal role in the Zulus' rise to power, was killed by his half-brothers in 1828. Internecine civil wars of this kind characterized Zulu politics throughout the 19th century. Cetshwayo's father Mpande, who was himself a half-brother of Shaka's, opposed Dingane and went into exile from the royal court in the 1830s. This all points to the decentralized nature of power within the Zulu state, as different chiefs had a large degree of independence in their own territories, but owed homage, military service and taxes to the king in the form of cattle and agricultural produce. Little is known of Cetshwayo's early life on a personal level, but we do know the political background against which he was growing up and how this affected him. In the late 1830s, when he was still just a boy of 6 or 7 years of age, his father began his final push to try to seize power from King Dingane, Cetshwayo's half-uncle. He did so with the aid not only of his Zulu allies, but also contingents of hundreds of Boers, newcomers to the area of European descent, who brought guns and other modern weaponry with them, and about whom we will hear a lot more as Cetshwayo's story unfolds. With his Zulu and Boer allies, Mpande defeated Dingane at the Battle of Makonkwa in KwaZulu-Natal on the 29th of January 1840. Dingane fled from the scene but was murdered afterwards by some Swazi and Nyawa tribespeople. This brought the First Zulu Civil War to an end. With this, Mpande became king of Zululand. Cetshwayo, although only a boy of 7 or 8, was his designated heir, as he had presented him as his Inkosana, his heir by his great wife, in the autumn of 1839. Hence, from a young age, Cetshwayo was being groomed to rule the Zulu people one day. In 1850, when he was 18 years of age, Cetshwayo was recruited into the Zulu Iboto, an elite regiment of Impi warriors, one which included several other members of the Zulu aristocracy. This was a rite of passage for any future Zulu, as every king was expected to primarily act as a warlord as well as an overlord. 2 years later, the Itulwana Iboto that he was a member of was involved in a military clash with the Swazis of Swaziland, a neighboring people that the Zulus were briefly at war with in the early 1850s. It was also at this time that he befriended Mnyamama, an Inkosi or chieftain of the Buthelezi sect of the Zulus, a man who would become his chief advisor in later years when Cetshwayo became the de facto king of the Zulus. By this time, Cetshwayo's great size was apparent. He eventually reached a height of 6.5 foot, which was matched by his great girth. At one point, he is believed to have weighed approximately 25 stone or 350 pounds, though this was not just fat. Years later, Cetshwayo was the first Zulu king to ever be photographed, and these pictures show a man of immense size, but powerful, certainly overweight, but also warrior-like in his own way. By the 1850s, he would also have been entering his first marriages. The exact number of wives and scale of his family is difficult to determine, a common feature of Zulu royal families, but we do know that his most important marriage was to a woman named Okamsweli, who bore him a son named Dinu Zulu in the mid-1860s, who would become his designated heir in later years. While Cetshwayo was the designated heir of Mpande, his route to the kingship was not smooth sailing. Throughout the 1850s and 1860s, he faced a number of rivals for power, these being from his extended family, in the shape of his half-brothers. His main rival for power in the 1850s was Mbuyazi, one of his half-brothers whom his father Mpande began to promote in the mid-1850s as a rival to Cetshwayo. Some of this was the normal political scheming of the Zulus, where potential successors as kings or chiefs were always being played off against each other to determine who was possibly the most capable future lord and military commander. But Mbuyazi was also increasingly his father Mpande's favorite. This is peculiar, for Mbuyazi's mother, Monase, had previously been a wife of King Shaka before his death in the 1820s, and there was a suspicion that Mbuyazi was actually a child of Shaka's. His position as a possible son of the great king may have been partly responsible for him being able to gather a large faction of supporters in the mid-1850s, while Cetshwayo had his own base of support on account of his father's earlier proclamation, back in 1839, of him as his heir. This was the context in which the Second Zulu Civil War broke out in 1856, between Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi to determine who would be their father's successor. In the end, the Second Zulu Civil War was a fairly short-lived affair. Once tensions boiled over between the half-brothers, Cetshwayo began mobilizing his supporters, which in the end numbered upwards of 20,000 Zulu warriors. Meanwhile, Mbuyazi headed south towards the Tugela River and the province of Natal, where his father had recently granted him lands. There, he built up his own support network. His army was substantially smaller than that of Cetshwayo. However, he benefited from an alliance with some of the local Boers, who brought modern European rifles and other weapons to his side. He also benefited from his army being commanded by a general named Nongolaza, who had been central to Mpande's victory over Dingane at the Battle of Makonkwa back in 1840. Now, Cetshwayo and Mbuyazi's forces met in a similarly decisive engagement in the Battle of Ndonda Kuska, near the Tugela River on the 2nd of December 1856. The battle was a brutal one, with thousands of Zulus killed, so much so that the site near it at the mouth of the Tugela River, where many of the bodies ended up afterwards, became known as Matambo, the place of bones. Mbuyazi was amongst the dead, and when the battle ended, Cetshwayo emerged victorious. His father, Mpande, would remain as the king in name, but Cetshwayo did not allow him to rule in practice thereafter, taking his revenge for Mpande's support for Mbuyazi by becoming the de facto ruler of Zululand henceforth, and even disparagingly referring to his father as Ixegwana, meaning the little old man. As bloody and as destabilizing as the civil wars within the Zulu realms during the 1850s and 1860s were, these were somewhat normal, a Zulu way of life, which had characterized their politics for decades. What was abnormal were events to the southwest and how they began to encroach in a growing manner into the life of the Zulus in the middle of the 19th century. Africa had not experienced the kind of extensive European colonization which had occurred in the Americas between the 16th and 18th centuries, a product of the climate and the presence of tropical diseases. The European presence was consequently limited to trading stations and small colonies at key locations around the coastline of sub-Saharan Africa. One of the most significant was the Cape Colony established at the southern point of Africa at what is now Cape Town, and its hinterland by the Dutch in the 1650s. This had subsequently become a haven for French and German Protestants fleeing religious persecution back in Europe, and the Franco-German Dutch community here became known as the Boers, an Afrikaans word meaning farmers. Their way of life in the Cape Colony was interrupted in 1806 when the British permanently took over the colony as part of the Napoleonic Wars, where Britain was at war with the Dutch, France's ally back in Europe, being ceded fully to Britain under the terms of the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1814. This was the beginning of a century of conflict and great change in southern Africa, of a kind which would impact enormously on Cetshwayo's reign and Zululand in general. Almost immediately from the point at which British rule became permanent in the Cape Colony, there were tensions between the new British administrators and the Boers, the latter of which were used to having a large degree of autonomy. New laws were imposed and taxes were increased, while the abolition of slavery in 1834 involved an overturning of the entire Boer economy, which had relied on approximately 35,000 slaves for labor, at a time when the Boer population was only slightly more than 30,000. The result of all this was that in 1836 groups of Boers began leaving the Cape Colony, along the southern coast and heading northeastwards towards the Orange River, in an exodus known as die Groot Trek, or the Great Trek, while the participants became known as the Voortrekkers, or Voortrekkers, or Pioneers. These Voortrekkers now began establishing new Boer states beyond the reach of the British Cape Colony. The Natalia Republic was the first of these Boer states, but it would be followed in years to come by the Orange Free State and South African Republic, while Griqua polities of mixed-race Boer and African people also emerged. Often these Boer republics were formed following clashes between the Voortrekkers and native groups, of which the Zulus were the most prominent. However, some came into being based on Boer-Zulu alliances. Cetshwayo's father, Mpande, had, for instance, formed an alliance with one of the Voortrekker leaders, Andries Pretorius, back in 1839. Their common ground was opposition to the British expansion, as no sooner had the Voortrekkers begun settling their new republics to the northeast of the Cape Colony than the British began also expanding northeastwards, trying to remove these new colonies as a threat to British control of southern Africa. In 1843, they annexed the Boer Natalia Republic and turned it into the British colony of Natal, near the southern borders of Zululand. Hence the Boers brought the British into the heartland of the Zulus from the 1830s onwards, and the clashes between the British and Zulus, which would come to characterize the latter half of Cetshwayo's reign, have their origins to some extent in the Great Trek. Cetshwayo's response to the Boers after becoming the power behind the throne in Zululand in late 1856 was complicated. His father had been allied with some of the Boers from as early as 1839, when he had acquired their aid to overthrow Dingane during the First Zulu Civil War. The situation was more complicated though from 1856 onwards, as the Boers had primarily supported Umbuyazi in the Second Zulu Civil War against Cetshwayo. Mpande had also agreed to relinquish some lands to the Boers in the 1840s as a reward for their aid in securing the Zulu throne. Finally, in the 1860s, the Boer republics continued to offer aid to rivals of Cetshwayo, and also act as a safe refuge for several of his half-brothers during periods when they were conspiring to undermine him. All of this ensured that Cetshwayo was less amenable to the Boers than his father had been. At the same time, it was a complicated balancing act, as not all the Boer groups were united, and some courted Cetshwayo in the 1850s and 1860s in the hopes of acquiring land concessions from him over other Boer groups. In short, it was a complex political environment. It was made more complicated by the ever-turbulent Zulu political system. In the 1860s, Cetshwayo had to contend with continuing efforts to remove him from his position of power. These came from Umtonga and Uhamika Nzibe, two other half-brothers. These were often in exile amongst the Boers of the South African Republic in the late 1850s and early 1860s, where Cetshwayo found it difficult to deal effectively with them, particularly Umtonga, while Uhame was in and out of Cetshwayo's favour in the 1860s. There were numerous approaches pursued by Cetshwayo to try to deal with these threats, in part by offering more powerful rivals like Umtonga lands on the periphery of Zululand, where they had to contend with the Boers of the South African Republic, while in the case of one set of rival half-brothers, he simply had them and their mother, one of his father Mpande's wives, killed. It was a tortuous political situation, and even in the 1870s, when Cetshwayo seemed to have completely consolidated his control over Zululand, there were episodes of unrest in which it appeared that a new civil war could break out at any moment. Such was the anarchic political system of the Zulus. While Cetshwayo was further consolidating his position as the heir to his father and the de facto ruler of the Zulu kingdom in the 1860s, events were occurring directly to the west which would serve to accelerate the speed of European intervention in his territory. In 1867, Erasmus Jacobs, a 15-year-old Boer whose family had settled on the Orange River after arriving from the Netherlands to southern Africa years earlier, discovered what he believed at first to be a small shiny rock. Upon seeing the item, his father Daniel suspected it was something else and gave it to a local man by the name of John O'Reilly to investigate further. Soon it was determined that it was in fact a diamond of a particularly high quality and was sold in the Cape Colony for £500, a substantial sum of money at the time. Word soon spread, and by the early 1870s, Kimberley region, near where the Jacobs had found what eventually became known as the Eureka Diamond, was experiencing a diamond rush as people came to mine and prospect in search of their fortune. Among them a young Cecil Rhodes, who would eventually become the most powerful figure in Southern Africa. Southern Africa would become the epicenter of the world diamond industry before long, to the extent that in years to come, Rhodes was able to manipulate world prices for the precious stones through the De Beers Mining Company, which he established. The diamond rush, which began at the very end of the 1860s, was a major spur towards British expansion in southern Africa in the 1870s, in ways which would have huge consequences for the Zulus and Cetshwayo. To British officials in Cape Town, the time had now come to try to unite the vast territories around southern Africa under British rule. There were reasons for doing so beyond the discovery of the diamond seams at Kimberley. By the dawn of the 1870s, the European age of imperialism was accelerating, as Britain and France in particular vied to control territories across Africa and Southeast Asia, as well as forcing China, Korea and Japan to open their countries after centuries of voluntary isolation from the rest of the world. The scramble for Africa followed, and the British were leading the way by consolidating their control over the southern reaches of the continent. Canada had provided an example for how they might achieve this. This was a country with a similar backstory to that of southern Africa. There had been a colony established there by the French in the 17th century, one which Britain wrested from it in 1763, at the end of the 7 Years' War, much like it had claimed the Cape Colony from the Dutch a half a century later. In the North American case, the British had also to deal with a former colonial population, which viewed themselves as French, native groups, and a vast region divided into district provinces and political entities. Yet in 1867, the British government had achieved a Canadian Confederation, whereby the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, with its people of French heritage, British administrators and native peoples were joined into a single country. Many people in both London and Cape Town began to believe that a similar union of the Cape Colony, the Boer republics, and the native polities such as the Zulu kingdom could be achieved, and British rule over southern Africa consolidated in the years to come. In doing so, stable control of the diamond trade could be secured. This would bring about the greatest clash between the British and the Zulus seen in the history of southern Africa. In October 1872, old King Mpande finally died in his mid-70s, after over 30 years on the throne. This was the moment which Cetshwayo had been anticipating for many years, when he could finally ascend in name as King of Zululand. Several days later, he convened a gathering of the Zulu chiefs, where his accession as king was formalized. Cetshwayo instantly moved to shore up his position by gaining formal recognition from the British. Back in 1861, an Englishman by the name of Theophilus Shepstone, who had arrived to the Cape Colony in 1820 with his preacher father when he was just 3 years old, and who had subsequently become one of the leading British officials in the Natal region on the frontier of the British Cape Colony in the 1850s, had visited Zululand. There, he had acknowledged Cetshwayo as Mpande's successor. He had impressed the Zulus, who had shown up in war dress to meet the British delegation, an action which Shepstone seemed unfazed by, and they would subsequently give him the nickname Cetshwayo, meaning famed black hunter in Zulu. In February 1873, Cetshwayo dispatched an emissary to Shepstone to inform him that he had succeeded his father and that he wished for Shepstone to visit Zululand to formally recognize him as the new king. When Shepstone did arrive to Zululand in August 1873, he was slightly irked to find that Cetshwayo had already been crowned in July, after the lengthy mourning period for Mpande was over. Despite this, a second coronation ceremony was carried out with Shepstone present. To Cetshwayo's mind, he was acquiring the recognition of a neighbouring power, which would strengthen him regionally, but Shepstone viewed it as a symbol of growing British influence on the borders of Zululand, and he intended in the years that followed to forge ahead with extending British control into Cetshwayo's territories. As was customary amongst the Zulus, Cetshwayo now set about establishing a new capital, something which every king did upon his accession. This was typically done in order to site the political centre of Zululand in the part of the kingdom where the new monarch's closest supporters lived, a measure which would ensure the safety of his uhlambi, or herd, which usually consisted of tens of thousands of animals and which formed the basis of the economic power of the monarch and chiefs. Cetshwayo chose to locate his capital at Ulundi, meaning the high place, a site located about 60 kilometers inland northwest from the port of Richards Bay today. It was relatively centrally located in the center of Zululand, and the site can still be visited today, with the Ondini Palace and Cultural Museum preserving the site of Cetshwayo's royal palace from a century and a half ago. Here he ruled Zululand over the remainder of the 1870s. He was more secure in his position than ever, but still there were periods of unrest, notably in the final weeks of 1877 and the start of 1878, when factions appear to have emerged in opposition to the king. Although he managed to stabilize the situation quickly, the incident points to the ever-present internal turmoil of Zululand, even as foreign adversaries were becoming more and more powerful along the borders of his kingdom. One of the advantages that Cetshwayo had was an army which had been molded by Shaka back in the late 1810s and 1820s into one of the more formidable fighting forces amongst the Bantu people that dominated much of sub-Saharan Africa. Zulu armies were divided into impis, regiments of fast-moving warriors armed primarily with short, stabbing spears and large cowhide shields for protection. Though these were ineffective against European rifles, battle formations were used, with a favoured method being the buffalo horn formation, whereby the left and right flanks moved forward on the sides of an enemy force like bullhorns, and then converging to encircle the enemy. While these were the core military methods of the Zulus, Cetshwayo's reign was notable for the large-scale introduction of European guns and weapons. Firearms like rifles had begun to spread extensively across southern Africa in the late 1860s and early 1870s, in large part owing to the emergence of the Boer republics and the migration towards the diamond mines in Kimberley. The latter site was a particularly good place for Zulus to obtain modern weapons, and so in the 1870s, Cetshwayo was actively acquiring guns to arm his impis. He was facilitated in this by the aid of John Dunn, a frontier hunter-trader operating in the Natal region, who became something of an advisor to Cetshwayo and was able to circumvent the British ban on selling firearms to the natives by importing from the Portuguese at Delagoa Bay in their colony of Mozambique to the north of Zululand. All of this was highly effective. One colonial newspaper in the Cape Colony claimed in August 1878 that there were as many as 20,000 firearms in Zululand, with the caveat, though, that the overwhelming majority were either second-hand rifles of questionable quality or else more antiquated muzzle-loading muskets of an 18th century design. Additionally, such guns are only functional as long as the supply of bullets and gunpowder lasts. As such, while many of Cetshwayo's soldiers were armed with guns by the late 1870s, these were often poor firearms and of limited use. The second half of the 1870s witnessed growing tensions all across the region, corresponding with northeastern South Africa today. The British, based out of Natal, just to the south of Zululand, were increasingly determined to bring the Boer republics and the native groups here under British rule. For their part, the Boers were anxious to maintain their independence and also to expand. This resulted in a war between the South African Republic and the Pedi or Marota people to the north of the Transvaal, under their leader Sekakuni in 1876. The Boers quickly annexed the Pedi Kingdom, an action which provided the leading British official in Natal, Theophilus Stepston, with an excuse to annex the South African Republic in 1877. The Boer state was largely powerless to prevent this in 1877, owing to a financial crisis of sorts there, and the growing incursions into the Transvaal, which had been underway for years owing to the diamond rush in Kimberley. However, the British annexation would only last a few years, and the South African Republic would re-establish its independence in 1881, following the brief First Boer War. Yet the immediate implication of the annexation in 1877 was that the British now surrounded much of Zululand, to both the south and the west. The noose was tightening on Cetshwayo. It wasn't only Shepstone who was determined to expand British rule across the vast region controlled by the Boer republics and the Zulus. In 1877, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, a Welsh administrator who had served extensively in British India, was appointed as the new High Commissioner for Southern Africa, a posting which made him the senior British official in the Cape Colony and Natal. He was determined to proceed with the Confederation policy. Immediately upon his arrival in Cape Town, he had launched a war against the Xhosa people to the northwest of the Cape Colony, and in early 1878 he gutted the Cape Colony administration, where many officials were opposed to an overly aggressive approach to the regions to the northeast, including Zululand. He also established a boundary commission to determine the exact border between Natal, the Transvaal and Zululand, before finally sending an ultimatum to Cetshwayo in December 1878, in response to a relatively minor clash on the border. This was deliberately designed to provoke conflict. Frere demanded that Cetshwayo hand over the individuals responsible for the border incident, pay a fine of hundreds of cattle, and allow the free entry of missionaries and British officials into Zululand. Most egregiously, he demanded that Cetshwayo disband the Zulu army and that a British resident would be installed in Ulundi, the implication being that this official would monitor the king's actions. This would doubtlessly have been a figure like Theophilus Shepstone, accompanied by a British regiment, and the ultimatum, which Cetshwayo was given just 20 days to respond to, was in essence a demand that the Zulu kingdom become a British protectorate, with Cetshwayo as a vassal of the Cape Colony. Unsurprisingly, when he received it, Cetshwayo began preparing his impis for war. The Anglo-Zulu War was fought over a period of just 6 months in the course of the first half of 1879. Yet despite how short the conflict was, it is probably the most celebrated of all the colonial conflicts fought in Africa or anywhere else during the age of European imperialism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. The war began on the 11th of January 1879. On New Year's Eve, Frere had granted Cetshwayo a brief extension to the ultimatum he had sent, while also ordering Lord Chelmsford, a senior British military commander in southern Africa, to begin preparing his troops at Rorke's Drift. a small British military station on the border with Zululand, to invade the Zulu kingdom. When the extension expired on the 11th, Chelmsford and his men marched into Zululand as an advance column, with further British troops and native auxiliaries being prepared in Natal for a larger invasion. Chelmsford's forces burned a small Zulu camp the following day. However, the invasion would be anything but straightforward. While the ultimatum and the extension to it, in late December 1878 and early January 1879, was still in force, Cetshwayo had been preparing his troops. The Zulus might have been outmatched by the British when it came to weaponry and tactics, but there was no doubt which side had the greater manpower to draw upon. By early January, Cetshwayo had tens of thousands of Zulu warriors armed and preparing for war. Upwards of 20,000 of these Zulu warriors engaged Chelmsford's advance column of troops, which consisted of just under 2,000 men, a combination of British troops and native auxiliaries, at the hill of Isandlwana in Zululand on the 22nd of January 1879. The Zulus were outmatched in terms of their armaments, with Chelmsford's forces largely equipped with breech-loading rifles, whereas only some of Cetshwayo's forces had firearms, and these were generally of an antiquated model. But with the Zulus outnumbering the British by nearly 10 to 1 and taken by surprise by the Zulu attack, Chelmsford's forces were heavily defeated. The central column of the British army, which was the forwardmost regiment, was completely destroyed, and after this the British beat a hasty retreat back towards Natal with just 500 or so soldiers, the rest lying dead on the battlefield. While Isandlwana was a disaster for the British war effort, a very different engagement was being fought at the British station at Rorke's Drift at almost exactly the same time, the same day as the attack on Chelmsford's advance party at Isandlwana. The station was defended by just 139 British troops, while a detachment of the Natal Native Regiment also showed up briefly to report on what had happened at Isandlwana earlier that morning. With this advance notice, Lieutenants John Chard and Gonville Bromhead were able to begin preparing some additional defences around the station, but even so, they were massively unprepared for the assault which came around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, particularly so once the Natal Native Regiment fled. Regardless of the odds being so heavily stacked against them, the small British garrison and civilians there conducted a brilliant defensive operation over the next several hours, repelling successive waves of attacks through to nearly 2 a.m. that night. When dawn broke the following morning, they realized that the Zulus, who had penetrated right up to the buildings of the station and engaged in close-quarters combat with the defenders the previous night, had departed. Cetshwayo had clearly decided that with hundreds of warriors dead or wounded at Rorke's Drift, it was not worth the damage that was being inflicted on his army to capture the station. One might have assumed that Cetshwayo would have been immensely happy with the opening clashes of the war, but this was not the case. While the Zulus had repelled the initial invasion and won one of the greatest victories achieved by an African army over a colonial force in the 19th century at Isandlwana, the cost in terms of men lost at both Isandlwana and Rorke's Drift was substantial, and many of those who made their way back to their homes were badly wounded from bullet wounds that Zulu medicine could not treat effectively. Furthermore, Cetshwayo had instructed his half-brothers and other commanders to take the fight into Natal once they had defeated Chelmsford's initial invasion force. They did not do this, and now back in Natal, Chelmsford was seeking reinforcements for a second foray. On the 11th of February, word arrived in London of the disaster of Isandlwana, and plans were immediately put in place by the government of Benjamin Disraeli to prepare for a second, much larger invasion of Zululand. On top of this, the initial clashes in January had shown Chelmsford that a more strategic approach would be more successful. When the second invasion of Zululand was launched in March, the lessons had been learned from the earlier clashes. Cetshwayo's cause was dealt a blow in early March when his half-brother and sometime senior advisor, Uhamu Kanzibe, defected to the British. The king was thrown by this betrayal at a time when he and his senior chiefs and warlords were preparing for the second stage of the war. Success was achieved, though, on the 12th of March, when a division of Zulu impis ambushed and destroyed a British convoy of nearly 100 soldiers near the Ntombe River. By the time this engagement was fought, however, the first divisions of British soldiers from abroad were arriving at the port of Durban in Natal, and the second invasion of Zululand under Chelmsford commenced in the second half of March 1879. This time, the British troops numbered well over 10,000, combined with thousands of native auxiliaries and a few thousand Boer allies. Thus, while the Zulus did manage to win one further victory over a column of British troops, commanded by Evelyn Wood at the Battle of Hlobane on the 28th of March, it was the last victory Cetshwayo would achieve. Just 24 hours after the Battle of Hlobane, the turning point in the Anglo-Zulu War came. This occurred at Eshowe, where a British force had been under siege by the Zulus for some time. Chelmsford's first action with his second invasion was to relieve Eshowe on the 29th of March. Here, a large force of upwards of 20,000 Zulus engaged the numerically much inferior British column. Unlike Isandlwana 2 months earlier, the British did not expose their advance column, opting for a slow defensive advance instead, which allowed them to repel successive Zulu attacks, much like the small garrison at Rorke's Drift had done. Using such tactics, they were able to inflict hundreds of casualties on the Zulus, who eventually disengaged, allowing Chelmsford to relieve Eshowe, with the loss of just a few dozen men. This was a major defeat for the Zulus in terms of their morale and belief in their ability to defeat the British, and from this point onwards they were preparing for a final clash around Cetshwayo's capital of Ulundi. As Chelmsford's armies moved methodically towards Ulundi in a cautious manner through the late spring and early summer of 1879, securing the countryside around them as they moved, Cetshwayo sent out envoys to them seeking peace terms. These became increasingly desperate, but Chelmsford was determined to win a complete victory before he was replaced by Sir Garnet Wolseley, a veteran military commander who had served in India during the Great Indian Mutiny of 1857, conquered much of the Ashanti Empire in northwest Africa in 1873 and 1874, and who had been dispatched by the British government to South Africa to replace Chelmsford after the disaster at Isandlwana. By late June, Chelmsford was closing on Ulundi, and Cetshwayo tried to sway him towards negotiating by sending him a tribute of his prized white cattle, but his own Amabuto elite warriors refused to take the cattle to Chelmsford. The final clash came just a few days later on the 4th of July. The Battle of Ulundi was more of a bloodbath than a fight. By now, Chelmsford had the use of several Gatling guns, an early type of machine gun, which combined with field artillery, thousands of well-armed British soldiers, and the use of cavalry divisions, ensured a swift victory over Cetshwayo's forces. There were just over a dozen British soldiers killed, while by the end of the engagement, hundreds of Zulus lay dead, and over 1,000 more were injured before Cetshwayo's impis fled. With victory won, Chelmsford ordered the burning down of the kraal and the wider settlement of Ulundi, all with the goal of restoring his reputation after the humiliation of Isandlwana 5 months earlier. With defeat at the Battle of Ulundi, many of the Zulu chiefs abandoned the war effort and began negotiating peace terms with the British. Cetshwayo ended up going into hiding. The British made public declarations of how the king was deposed by them and that they were now intent on dividing Zululand up into 13 different territories, along the lines of the individual chiefdoms who had previously owed their allegiances to the Zulu king. Faced with utter defeat, Cetshwayo and his followers surrendered at the military camp of Garnet Wolseley on the 31st of October 1879, who by then had replaced Chelmsford as the senior commander in charge of the British war effort. There, he was not even greeted by the senior British military commanders, but was instead informed by a junior officer that not only was he no longer king, but he was also to be exiled from Zululand and sent to live in Cape Town under a loose arrest as a political prisoner. Cetshwayo is said to have wept when he learned this. Nevertheless, 4 days later, he duly boarded HMS Natal and sailed for Cape Town, the first time he had ever set foot on a boat. He was photographed during the journey, smiling ruefully at the camera. In Cape Town, Cetshwayo was detained at the Castle of Good Hope, the oldest fortification in the colony, built by the Dutch shortly after they arrived there in the 1650s. There he maintained a small court of his closest allies and followers, who had elected to join him in exile from Zululand. This small cohort of fallen Zulu nobles might well have simply rotted away in Cape Town had it not been for wider events in the early 1880s. No sooner had Cetshwayo left Zululand than conflicts and revolts began breaking out in several places, some of it driven by the heavy-handed methods of Garnet Wolseley and the military, and others due to renewed internal fighting amongst the Zulus, while the Basuto gun war also broke out in what is now Lesotho in September 1880, between the British and the Basuto people there. Another major development, arguably the most significant of the period, was the outbreak of a revolt in the Transvaal by the Boers against the recently established British rule. The short First Boer War, as it is known, between December 1780 and March 1781, resulted in the re-establishment of the South African Republic as an independent Boer state, weakening British control over the region once again. But the most pressing issue in terms of Zululand was the outbreak of the Third Zulu Civil War, one fought between numerous factions, though it eventually coalesced into a clash between a claimant to the Zulu crown, Zibebu, and supporters of the exiled Cetshwayo and the royal family. This conflict ensured that British administrators failed to establish coherent control over Zululand in the aftermath of the Anglo-Zulu War, and also paved the way for Cetshwayo's political rehabilitation. In Cape Town, Cetshwayo was subtly orchestrating his return to power. The ability of an African leader during this period to quickly acclimatize to the very different politics of the European newcomers to the continent and Cetshwayo's own political acumen was seen in his subsequent actions. The government of the Conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, an imperialist who had been British head of state since 1874, had come to an end in April 1880. His successor was William Gladstone, the leader of the Liberals and a markedly less enthusiastic supporter of British imperialism abroad. Under the new regime, a softer approach was taken towards the Zulus and Cetshwayo. Cetshwayo arrived in London in August 1882. There he was welcomed warmly in many parts of the British press, who perceived him as a dignified character who had been mistreated by the administrators of the Cape Colony and Natal. This perception was aided by the dissemination of photos of the former Zulu king taken by Alexander Bassano, a leading portraitist of the day, at Old Bond Street. There Cetshwayo was pictured clothed in a European-style coat, suit and tie, and looking every inch the part of what Victorian society expected of a supposedly civilized native ruler. It was a shrewd piece of propaganda which aided his campaign. While in London, he stayed at 18 Melbury Road in Holland Park in Kensington, a site which is marked by a plaque today to commemorate his residence there back in 1882. In the early stages of his visit, he toured famous sites around London, followed constantly by an entourage of his own servants and interpreters, but also a group of journalists who reported on his movements to the public. And all of this worked. The newspapers in the autumn of 1882 clearly show the British public was being broadly sympathetic towards the Zulu cause and was somewhat opposed to the colonial administration's actions in southern Africa. Whenever he appeared at the window of his temporary home on Melbury Road, a crowd of observers outside would offer up cheers of support. The real goal of Cetshwayo's mission, however, was not to win over the hearts and minds of the British public, but to convince the government that he should be restored to his throne, and if necessary supported by the British to re-establish himself in Zululand. The deposed king held out the promise that he could restore stability amongst the Zulus in the context of the civil war there. In this, Cetshwayo won an early ally within the government to his cause, in the shape of the Earl of Kimberley, John Woodhouse, who was serving as the Secretary of State for the colonies. With Woodhouse's encouragement, Gladstone and his ministers began preparing the groundwork for Cetshwayo's restoration, and a meeting with Queen Victoria whilst the Zulu lord was in England was organised. Oddly, when he met the Queen on the 14th of August 1882, who was somewhat of a recluse for much of her reign, it was not in London, but on the Isle of Wight at Osborne House. The visit was attended by a handful of British officers who had served in the Anglo-Zulu War, and this created a tense atmosphere. Nevertheless, Victoria was impressed by the deposed king, who was clearly nervous on meeting her and noted in her journal that I recognized in him a great warrior who had fought against us, but rejoiced we are now friends. After the Queen responded favorably to him, Gladstone was able to sanction Cetshwayo's re-establishment as the king of the Zulus. Cetshwayo's hopes of being fully restored to his position as king were quickly dispelled on his return to Africa. There he learned that the British intended to partition Zululand into a number of different zones, and that he was only being restored as king and ruler of the central sections of Zululand, with the other regions bestowed on some of the other chiefs amongst the Zulus. This was a way of ending the civil war for the British, while also being a way to divide and rule, which the British had been employing in colonial settings since the 16th century, when they were first deployed in Ireland against the more powerful Gaelic lords there. Furthermore, when he proceeded towards Zululand, it became clear that he was not allowed to rule even this smaller territory freely. There would be British overseers watching everything and sanctioning or disallowing policy approaches dependent on whether they suited British interests. Gallingly, one of the senior figures appointed to do so was none other than Sir Theophilus Shepstone, who had played such a prominent role in the British incursion into Zululand in the 1870s. It was in these less than ideal circumstances that Cetshwayo began to try to reassert his power over the Zulu people in 1883. The restored king's role in the Third Zulu Civil War was confined to just a few months. He quickly began gathering his supporters to him in early 1883 to wage war on Zibebu and his faction. A major clash followed at the Battle of Msebe in March 1883, near what is now the town of Nongoma. There, Zibebu was aided by the Boers and managed to score a victory over Cetshwayo's supporters. The king himself was not there, but with the loss of several thousand warriors, his position was massively weakened. It was followed up by Zibebu in July 1883, where he attacked Cetshwayo's kraal at Undini, rampaging through the place. Cetshwayo was forced to flee, but in the ferocious massacre which Zibebu and his followers unleashed, 3 of Cetshwayo's wives were killed and 1 of his young sons. The makeshift court was burned to the ground. Cetshwayo himself was set upon by some Zulu warriors while attempting to escape and was stabbed in several places. He still managed to escape. From this point onwards, he lived as something of a fugitive, until he died at a British protected residence near Ishui, the scene of one of the major clashes of the Anglo-Zulu War 5 years earlier. His death came in the afternoon of the 8th of February 1884. The cause of his passing, while still in his early 50s, remains unclear. Officially, it was recorded as a heart attack, a not entirely implausible scenario given his obesity, but there were widespread suspicions at the time that he was poisoned, and indeed he had just eaten and retired to his chamber when he died. No autopsy, though, was carried out, and the cause of his death will forever remain an open question. Cetshwayo's small court of remaining followers attempted to give him a funeral and burial in accordance with the customs for a Zulu king, but it had little of the fanfare that would have accompanied his passing had he died 10 years earlier, before the British intervention in Zululand. After a period of time, he was placed in a huge coffin in a sitting position, according to tradition, and taken by wagon to Nkandla Forest. There he was buried in a valley below Bobe Ridge. In 1980, nearly a century after his death, black granite slabs were placed over the grave, and 8 small obelisks ringed with chains were put up to mark the site where the last independent king of the Zulus was buried. His son, Dinu Zulu, succeeded him and was recognized by the British as the rightful king of Zululand. He managed to re-establish the royal family's power by allying with some of the Boers, who provided him with aid against Zibebu, in return for a section of Zululand which they subsequently established as a new Boer state again. This called the Nieuwe Republiek, or New Republic. It only existed for 4 years before being absorbed into the South African Republic. Meanwhile, in the course of the second half of the 1880s, the British continued to expand into Zululand and directly annexed territory there into the Cape Colony. Dinu Zulu was eventually arrested and shipped to the island of St. Helena in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean as a prisoner in 1890. He remained there until 1897, when he was allowed to return home to a region where Zululand had been all but eradicated as a political entity and annexed by the British. Ultimately, the story of the decline of Zululand and the tripartite conflicts between the British, the Boers and the Zulus did not end in the 1880s. While the Zulus were broken as a political power by the Anglo-Zulu War and the Third Zulu Civil War, in the final years of Cetshwayo's life, the Boers remained a powerful group, one which had managed to defeat the world's foremost imperial power in the First Boer War and to re-establish the South African Republic in the Transvaal. But the possibility of fresh conflict was accelerated in 1886 when gold was discovered at Witwatersrand in the Boer territory. In what became the largest gold rush in history, tens of thousands of settlers arrived to the Boer state, establishing the town of Johannesburg from nothing to become a city of over 100,000 people by the mid-1890s. As this occurred, the imperative for the British, who had continued to expand north into what is now Zimbabwe, but was then called Rhodesia after Cecil Rhodes, became to conquer the South African Republic, the greatest of the Boer states, along with the Orange Free State. After the botched Jameson Raid, engineered by Cecil Rhodes in the winter of 1895 to 1896, failed to overthrow the Boer government of Paul Kruger in the South African Republic, a more conventional war was entered into in 1899. The Second Boer War would last down to 1902 and was a highly unpopular war for the British, with widespread international condemnation of the use of concentration camps in which tens of thousands of Boer women and children died. Some Zulus fought with the Boers in the conflict, but many more were by then being co-opted into the British military as native auxiliaries. When the war ended in 1902, the Boer republics came to an end and were incorporated as British colonies. 8 years later, the Union of South Africa created the modern-day state of South Africa for the first time, out of the Cape Colony, the former Boer republics and Zululand. Thus, 28 years after Cetshwayo's death, the British efforts to consolidate their control of southern Africa into one colony were finally realized. King Cetshwayo was a formidable ruler of the Zulus. Any assessment of his life should acknowledge that the Zulu political system was somewhat anarchic and unstable. It was rife with conflict throughout the century, from the first rise of the Zulus in the second half of the 18th century right down to Cetshwayo's death in 1884. Several major civil wars were fought, and in between those, there was constant rivalry amongst competing lords and members of the royal family to establish themselves as ruler. Even the Great Shaka, despite transforming the Zulus into the dominant power in the region, only lasted just over a decade before being murdered by his half-brothers. Conversely, Cetshwayo managed to establish himself as the de facto power behind the throne during his father's reign, and held power firmly for nearly a quarter of a century, between the mid-1850s and the late 1870s. This was a significant achievement. Furthermore, the fact that he managed to form alliances with many of the Boer groups who moved into the region in the mid-century, and even negotiated with the British to be restored to his throne in 1882, demonstrates his political acumen. Had he been born in more propitious times or in another part of the world, he might have enjoyed a long and prosperous reign. His curse was to be the king of the Zulus at a time when the pull of diamonds and gold ensured the British state was determined to keep expanding in southern Africa. That expansion led to the birth of the state of South Africa, but it came at the expense of the Boers and Cetshwayo and his Zulu subjects. What do you think of King Cetshwayo? Was he a victim of British imperial aggression, or was the Zulu political system ultimately far too unstable to survive in southern Africa in the long run? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.